Hi, child development students. Today we're going to be covering one of my favorite chapters, chapter 15, Facilitating Social Development. I really like this chapter because there are a lot of great scenarios and things that we can connect to from our own experiences. And I think it really just sheds light on how important social and emotional development are for children, and how even in the simplest interactions, we can learn a lot, and we can also teach children a lot. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, as always, we're going to be covering our objectives. Number one, after reading this chapter, you should be able to explain how social development is related to other areas of development, provide an example of why it is difficult to define appropriate social skills, describe how social skills are developed and the impact a developmental problem can have on their development, outline the role of early learning programs play in the development of play skills, list strategies that teachers can use to structure and support peer interactions, and describe the process teachers might use if children need additional support in the area of social development. So once again, in order to help retain this information and to use our information processing theory to help recover this information later when we need to know this information, is to read the objective first and stop and think about what you know about it. And so I have a feeling, because we've all probably seen children in social environments, we ourselves have been in social environments, you probably have a lot of prior knowledge that you can already add to these objectives. So for example, the first one, explain how social development is related to other areas of development. So think about social development and how social development might be impacted by or from physical development, cognitive development, linguistic development. So we can think about all of the different ways that social development can be influenced by or can influence some of these other areas of development. So take a moment, think about how these objectives connect to things that you already know. And then again, at the end, we will revisit these objectives, and then hopefully your learning will be enhanced through the content introduced in the chapter. All right, we ready to dive in? Let's begin. All right, so social development, the four hows: how to approach, how to interact, how to deal with difference, how to manage conflict. So those are the four hows in social development. Social skills and overall development. Social skills cannot be separated from overall development. So in other words, they don't happen in a vacuum. Social skills are part of or happen within overall development. While engaged in a social conversation, language, physical skills, and cognitive skills are intertwined. So that really connects to the first one. So when you're engaged in a social conversation, when you're observing children in a social conversation, all of those different aspects, those domains, language, physical skills, and cognitive skills, they're all connected. Therefore, social skills need to be both taught and reinforced to all children. So the textbook, this particular chapter, will talk about instances where social skills can happen. Social skills teaching can happen in a naturalistic setting, and then sometimes we need to step in and teach them in a very explicit way. Defining appropriate social skills. Appropriate social skills are rules and expectations prescribed by particular groups as to how group members will conduct themselves in private and in public. So one thing that I want to point out, the textbook goes into different scenarios as well, is that appropriate might look different in one scenario versus another scenario. And so that's important. And that's what children learn in context as they develop. So how they might behave on the playground at school might be different than how they behave in the house when they're in the home of their caregivers, or even playground at school versus in the classroom at school. And so those social skills might look different depending on the context and the situation. Also, the major social skills learned in early childhood relate to getting along with others. So interactions with others can be enhanced and influenced by the social skills that are learned in early childhood. So that's important for helping children develop relationships. Children need to be provided opportunities to interact with peers, adults, and family members. So this might sound pretty obvious, but it's important to note that if children are not given opportunities to interact with others, then they will not be able to as adequately develop those social skills. So you need to be in situations where you're going to be able to practice those social skills. And that would include not just with your peers, but also with adults, because those interactions can look different, and also family members. So providing as many opportunities for interaction will help children to develop those social skills. Acquiring social skills. So how does one obtain or develop these social skills? So one thing to think about is temperament and emotion. So there's three main types of temperament that are described by child developmentalists, and that would be easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. Emotions are felt, but reactions to the emotions are learned. So I'm sure we've all seen those situations where a child falls down and then they look around to see the reaction. And if we say, oh no, then what usually happens? The child cries, they're afraid because they're mirroring the reaction that they're seeing. But if a child falls, they look around and the adult face is calm and reassuring. You're okay. Okay, let's keep going. Then chances are, of course, unless the child is actually really hurt, chances are the child will mirror that response from the adult. Oh, I'm okay. Things are okay. Things are calm. I can continue what I was doing before I fell. And also appropriate responses to an emotion need to be taught. So learning that, for example, if somebody falls down, it's not appropriate to laugh, right? If somebody is sad, it's okay to also mirror empathy or, put your arm around them. Are you okay? Are you feeling okay? So modeling appropriate responses to emotional need is an important part of child development and helping them to acquire those social skills. Funny little story, about 2 years ago, I was at an indoor playground at a mall with my son Noah, who was probably about 5 years old at the time, maybe 4. And I remember watching him, sitting with Colson, and I was watching Noah, and a little girl, probably 2 or 3 years old, she fell down and she was crying. And not proud to say it, but I see Noah standing next to her and he was going, ah ha 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 ha, ah ha 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 ha. And I was so embarrassed. So I went over to Noah and I explained to him, this little girl, she's hurt. You need to ask her if she's okay. So I'm trying to explain to him, teasing is not an appropriate response. She's crying, she's hurt. Even though my son doesn't know this little girl, it's still, in terms of empathy and just common decency and humanity, you don't laugh and tease when somebody's fallen down. So I drove that point home because, again, I was mortified that he's teasing this poor little girl who's fallen in and is crying. So fast forward maybe about 15, 20 minutes later, there was a little boy in the same playground. He falls down, and then my son Noah goes up to him and he says, "Are you okay? Do you need help? Are you okay?" And there was a parent sitting next to me on the bench watching her child, and she commented and said, "Wow, your son is so polite and so well behaved." And the type of parent I am, I just completely told on myself, and I said, well, let me just let you in a little secret. Not less than 20 minutes ago, and then I explained the situation where he's teasing the little girl who fell. And so we laughed about it, and we basically said, okay, well, you kind of fake it till you make it. In other words, even though no one maybe didn't necessarily feel compassion for the little boy who fell, the second incident, I was still taking him through the motions of asking, even though maybe it wasn't as sincere as it could have been at that point. He's still going through the motions of asking if they were okay and stopping and pausing and, definitely not laughing. So I thought that was really funny. So now, I think Noah has developed much more empathy. So that was just a funny example of how it's taught. And from literally 20 minutes later, I tried to reform his sense of compassion and empathy. Social reinforcement, so adult responsiveness. This refers to how an adult responds to a young child's needs. Is the adult meeting the child's needs right away? Are they waiting? How are they meeting the child's needs? Is it with patience? Is it with compassion? Are they impatient? etc. If the response is immediate and appropriate, then the child and the adult are satisfied. If the response is delayed or inappropriate, then the child becomes mistrustful and wary of the environment. So this is an important thing. This goes back to Erik Erikson's trust versus mistrust, and the idea that you can't spoil a newborn, in the sense that when a child is a few months old, their only way to communicate really is by crying. And so that's to express multiple needs, whether it's they're hungry, whether they're scared, whether they're cold, whether their diaper is wet, whatever the case is, they have really one way to communicate. And so their needs are being expressed through the crying. And so if the adult is meeting those needs quickly, then that's reinforcing the child is feeling, okay, if I cry when something's wrong, then my need gets met. And so it becomes this reinforced behavior, and the child begins to depend on the adult to satisfy their needs. And so it develops this sense of trust. I know that a caregiver will come and provide this love or shelter or food, whatever it is, these basic needs being met. And so the trust, the bond is being developed through that relationship. And if that isn't happening, as stated here, then the child becomes mistrustful and wary of the environment. The impact of developmental problems. Infants who do not respond in the typical sense with smiles, coos, or eye gazing often are not stimulated by the caregivers to express emotion. And this is an interesting one. The social smile usually begins, I would say, 4 to 8 weeks after birth. So the newborn, anyone who's been around newborns knows that it's a very challenging time in the life of a caregiver. It's often marked with sleepless nights, and meeting someone's needs, someone who's helpless, meeting their needs literally 24/7 can be very taxing and emotionally draining and physically draining. But in those 4 to 8 weeks, when the social smile emerges from the infant, that is huge for the caregiver, because then the caregiver is receiving this reinforcement like, oh, I'm doing something right. I'm getting this smile, this coo. And so that reinforces the caregiver to continue, staying up the sleepless nights and, all of the care that is required by this newborn now is being almost rewarded by these smiles and coos. So I remember when my son Noah, when we went in for one of his first checkups, and the pediatrician was checking for the social smile, and that's when she said, this is when they give it back to you. This is when all the, basically everything that they're draining from you as a newborn, they're giving it back to you through the social smiles, the coos, the eye gazing. And then sometimes with children who maybe have a developmental disability, for example, they might not be able to respond with the smiles and coos and eye gazing in the same way or within the same time. And so sometimes that impacts the relationship between the child and the caregiver, because again, these responses from the child are reinforcing, and they're motivating, they're encouraging the caregiver. When you're sleep deprived and you're tired and you're holding this baby, you haven't showered and you've hardly eaten, but then you see this smile or this coo, then you're all in, you're connected. But imagine that relationship being one-sided, where you're not getting that feedback, and so it can be difficult for that bond to form. Also, overstimulated children tend to withdraw and turn away from caregivers' show of emotion. And so that's something that we call affect regulation. So when, you have caregivers who are, doing a lot of motherese, and they're stimulating the child either through voice or through toys, etc. Usually babies, they know when it's too much, when they're overstimulated, they can turn away. They can turn away from it. That's they're regulating their affects. They're realizing this is too much stimulation. I need to disengage. But sometimes, if it's an extreme situation, the child might continue to withdraw. Over-responding children cannot control their responses and often turn a caregiver off emotionally. And so that's, again, something to think about for both typical and atypically developing children. If children are overly responding, they're not able to regulate those emotions, and that can be very draining and difficult. And as it says here, it can turn a caregiver off emotionally. It just becomes too much, and the caregiver can't continue to meet the needs of the child. Also, social skills happen in a sequential format. First, we have attachment that starts very early, and then joint attention is when two or more children, or it can be a child and a caregiver, are attending their attention to one object simultaneously. There's separation protest, or what we know as separation anxiety, when the child is upset when the caregiver leaves the room or out of view. Fear of strangers, stranger anxiety or stranger danger, theory of mind, and pretend and role playing. So these are some social skills and how they develop over time. The role of early learning programs. Play. So with play, we have a variety of different categories. We have unoccupied behavior, onlooker behavior, solitary play, parallel play, associative play, and cooperative play. So we'll notice that as children develop, they engage in more play with others. But in the earlier stages of play, the play tends to be solitary, or it might be parallel play where children can play alongside each other, but not with each other. Teaching children to play. So if I haven't emphasized it yet, I'm going to say play is the work of children. There's so many amazing quotes from different educational experts and theorists and philosophers that play is truly the work of children. So many benefits can come through play. So teaching children to play, arrange for children to be near each other. That would be helpful, right? Physically guide them into the play, give them materials to stimulate play, place objects in their hands, verbalize actions. Joseph, throw the ball to Emily, and rejoice. Yay, great job. You did a good job of catching the ball with both hands. And then help others join in. Hey guys, why don't we all come over here and join in, and we're going to play with the parachute today. Also provide social reinforcement. Move the child toward a group. The teacher slowly removes herself from the play experience. And gentle insistence. This is when the teacher gently prods a child into participating in an activity. Incidental social learning. This is where the caregiver or facilitator explains differences among children as needed. And in the textbook, Louise Durnan Sparks, I believe that's on page 398 in the textbook, does a really good job of outlining these different frames or pieces of advice and approaches that teachers should take when we are explaining differences among children. So answer questions honestly and openly. So if a child is concerned, they see a child with an eye patch or a child in a wheelchair and they're worried, am I going to become paralyzed and not be able to walk? Or a child who has a deformity and they don't want to touch that child. And so Louise Durnan Sparks in the book talks about how we need to answer questions honestly and openly. We don't want to shush them. We don't want to pretend because it's uncomfortable for us to talk about, because that also might shame the child with a disability. So we need to openly discuss it, but discuss it honestly and openly. Use simple words that the child can understand, but also try to use the appropriate terminology when you can, and then encourage social interactions between those children. So really important to help foster the social interactions and to explain differences between the children in the classroom. Okay. So in order to encourage incidental social learning, move closer to the children playing, smile and encourage play with all children, bring new materials to the interaction, and make encouraging comments. Keep the play going. Sharing and turn taking. That is a difficult concept for children because they have to give up what is theirs to meet the needs of someone else. And if you think about it, that's a concept that honestly some adults have a hard time being able to do. So I think that it makes sense that children who are still learning and, they're very egocentric for a big part of their childhood. And so it's difficult. It's a difficult concept to give up something that is mine to meet the needs of someone else. So I have to then understand and care about someone else's wants and needs and then give up something that I have ownership over. So that's a very difficult concept. Again, many adults have a hard time with this as well. Self-assertion. Teach children to stand up for what is theirs and not let others just take from them. And I think that's an important one too, because sometimes, as parents, we obviously, kindness is huge. And I think that's something that a lot of parents these days are talking about, choose kindness. I think that was a tagline from the movie Wonder. And it's important for kids to be kind, but we also don't want kids to be so passive to the point that they are easily taken advantage of or easily bullied. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't want to make it seem like children are at fault when they're bullied, but to assert yourself is a very important skill for children to learn. And I don't think it's you're either kind or you're assertive. I think it's both. So I think it's important to keep in mind children can be kind and also assertive and be able to stand up for themselves when the time is needed to advocate for yourself. Materials and equipment. Provide multiple materials in areas where more than one child can play at a time. So obviously having, thinking about supply and demand, that will help eliminate conflict with children, and encourage imitation by providing two of some toy. So if Barbara is playing with a truck, then you can have another truck over here so that Hillary can play with the truck too. They can both do the same thing with the truck and practice dumping materials out of the same type of truck because they have two of that toy. Imitation and modeling. Arrange the environment to ensure that interactions take place. Reinforce children for playing together, so providing praise, and reinforce imitation of appropriate behaviors. So again, children are looking at models and thinking about reinforcing behaviors. So if you're offering praise and you're reinforcing behaviors that you want to see, they're more likely to duplicate those appropriate behaviors. Teacher-structured peer interactions. Create activities in which all children must participate for the game to work. So that's one way to try to incorporate all of the children to participate, is to create an activity where all of the kids need to be present or need to participate in order for the game to work. Discovery play sets up the activity for the children to engage in and work together. Teacher-structured peer interactions continued. Peer tutoring and peer mediating can be a very, very useful tool. Children who are typically developing are given a chance to explain a new idea to a peer. Mediation is done to keep children engaged, and children with disabilities get the chance to play with others. Teachers provide support and encouragement. Also, in peer tutoring, the child with the disability learns from the peer. The peer is given a chance to refine and master a skill. Additional ways teachers can structure and facilitate learning. We can choose stories that focus on character development. We can practice manners. We can seat children close to appropriate models at circle time and large group activities. We can provide group projects, and we can initiate a buddy center. Fair play. This is when rules in the classroom are for everyone, so they're universal across the board. No one child should be allowed to break rules because of his or her disability. Encourage rule following and reward appropriate behaviors. So those are the characteristics of fair play. When more intervention is needed, provide a quiet, small group area for the child to practice social interaction. So maybe they need to be away from the larger group and they need to practice these social interactions on a smaller scale. Give the child time to practice with the teacher before engaging with another child. So they're practicing that behavior. So this is when explicit teaching is necessary. Use the tiered framework approach for intervention to model support. Also, one-to-one shadowing could be necessary. This is where we model and support the child in their interaction. So we learned a lot in this chapter about social development, and so we're going to go back to those objectives that we covered at the beginning to see how much new information you've learned. So once again, objectives revisited. After reading this chapter, you should now be able to explain how social development is related to other areas of development, provide an example of why it is difficult to define appropriate social skills, Describe how social skills are developed and the impact a developmental problem can have on their development. Outline the role of early learning programs, play in the development of play skills. List strategies that teachers can use to structure and support peer interactions. And finally, describe the process teachers might use if children need additional support in the area of social development. So once you read through these objectives, you should be able to articulate some of the key elements that we talked about in this chapter. And if there are any areas that you feel still a little unsure, a little foggy about, then by all means, go back to the text, go back to the chapter, and reread. Yeah, you can go back and review your notes. You can review the textbook and then go back to enhance your learning and make sure that that information is retained. Hope you learned a lot. Again, it was a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, everyone.